The deep void of space stretched endlessly, dotted with distant stars that flickered like forgotten memories. The Vanguard, a human warship on a routine patrol, glided silently through the darkness. Inside, the crew carried out their duties with the calm precision of experienced soldiers. It was supposed to be another uneventful mission, until the distress signal came. "Commander Rourke," a young officer called out, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "We're receiving an old distress signal. Human origin." Rourke frowned, stepping closer to the comm station. "Source." The officer hesitated. "That's the strange part, sir. It's coming from the Eurus system." A heavy silence settled over the bridge. The Eurus system had been abandoned for 80 years. No colonies, no stations, just a graveyard of lost ships and broken history. Whatever was in that system, it shouldn't have been sending signals. "Put it on speakers," Rourke ordered. The transmission crackled with static before a weak, distorted voice cut through. "This is static. Human vessel. We are under attack. I repeat, we are under static. Need immediate assistance. Anyone, please." Then silence. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The message wasn't new. It was ancient. And yet, they were hearing it now, in real time. Lieutenant Kai, the ship's tech expert, tapped rapidly on his console. "Sir, this isn't a looping signal. It's not repeating on a cycle. It's as if it's being broadcast live." Rourke's stomach tightened. That was impossible. "Navigation," he barked. "Set a course for Eurus. Full speed." The Vanguard changed direction, its engines roaring as it accelerated toward the system. As they approached, the stars seemed to dim, swallowed by an unnatural stillness. Then, the ship's scanners picked up something massive drifting in orbit around a dead planet. "A dreadnought," whispered Bonner, the ship's weapons officer. "But not one of ours." On the main display, the image sharpened. A colossal alien battleship, its hull scarred and broken, floating lifelessly in the void. It was unlike anything the crew had ever seen, with jagged architecture that looked almost organic, like something grown rather than built. But there was something else, something far more disturbing. "Sir," Kai's voice wavered, "I'm picking up human life signs on that ship." Rourke's blood ran cold. That was impossible. No human had set foot in this system for 80 years. Bonner exhaled sharply. "What the hell is going on?" Rourke didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he made his decision. "Prepare a boarding party." The boarding shuttle glided through the dark void, closing the distance between the Vanguard and the alien dreadnought. Inside the shuttle, Commander Rourke and his team sat in tense silence, weapons ready, their armor systems active. The only sound was the soft hum of the engines. Bonner, tightening the straps on his rifle, broke the silence. "This feels wrong." Rourke didn't disagree. Everything about this mission felt wrong. A distress signal from the past, a lifeless alien ship carrying human life signs, and now they were about to step into a place where no human had walked for 80 years. The shuttle's autopilot engaged the docking sequence, attaching itself to a breach point near what looked like an entrance. The ship's exterior was unnatural, its jagged black metal reflecting no light, as if it absorbed it. The moment the shuttle connected, there was a deep metallic groan, as if the ship itself had felt their presence. "Airlock cycling," Kai announced. "Pressure stable. Oxygen present, but stale." "Helmets stay on," Rourke ordered. He didn't trust the atmosphere. The airlock hissed open. The team stepped inside. Darkness swallowed them. Their helmet lights flickered on, casting long shadows against the walls. The interior was vast, with corridors stretching into the unknown. The walls were smooth but covered in strange, vein-like patterns, as if the ship itself had once been alive. Kai checked his scanner. No movement detected. No sound either. It's completely dead. Rourke took the lead, motioning for the team to advance. Their footsteps echoed softly, the only sound in the silence. The deeper they went, the colder it felt, not just in temperature, but in something deeper, something that sent a primal unease crawling up their spines. Then they found the bodies. Bonner cursed under his breath. What the hell? Scattered across the corridor were human corpses, or at least, what was left of them. Their armor was old, outdated by decades, but it was undeniably human military gear. Their bodies were frozen in unnatural positions, like they had died in mid-motion. Some were reaching for their weapons, others clutching their throats. Their faces were twisted in expressions of horror, their eyes wide open, staring at something unseen. But there was no sign of blood, no wounds, no gunfire marks, just stillness. Kai's voice was barely above a whisper. They didn't just die. They were stopped. Bonner scanned the corridor ahead, his grip tightening on his rifle. I don't like this. Let's grab what we need and get the hell out. Rourke nodded. Agreed. Kai, get a data download from their logs. Bonner, check for any survivors. They moved quickly, searching the nearby chambers. Everything was eerily intact, like the ship had been abandoned in an instant. Equipment lay untouched, consoles still hummed faintly with power. But every time they turned a corner, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. Then, Kai's scanner glitched. Wait, he frowned, tapping the screen. I just picked up movement. Bonner turned sharply. Where? Kai adjusted the settings. It was just for a second. Flickered in and out, like something was. The lights flickered. The entire ship groaned, a deep metallic sound that vibrated through the walls. The bodies on the floor shifted ever so slightly, as if something had disturbed them. Bonner raised his rifle. What the hell was that? Kai's scanner went wild. I don't know. There's something here, but it's not showing up properly. Rourke spoke fast. We're moving. Now. They turned back toward the airlock, only to freeze in place. The corridor was no longer empty. At the far end, barely visible in the flickering light, figures stood in the darkness, silent, motionless. And then, they started walking. Their movements were unnatural, their forms flickering like distorted holograms, phasing in and out of sight. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. Their armor was wrong, mismatched, as if made from the remnants of those who had died here before. And they made no sound. Bonner's voice was tight. Rourke, don't move, Rourke ordered. The figures stopped. The silence pressed in, suffocating. Then, one of the bodies on the floor sat up. Kai screamed. The thing turned its head toward them, eyes hollow and empty. And then, as if triggered by the movement, the entire corridor erupted in chaos. The figures rushed forward. Bonner opened fire. His bullets tore through them, but there was no impact, no blood, no wounds. They kept coming, their forms flickering with each step. Kai was struggling with his scanner. They aren't real. There, one of the creatures phased through the wall, its flickering hands reaching for Bonner. He barely dodged in time, its touch passing through his armor like mist, but leaving a deep, freezing pain in its wake. Rourke grabbed Kai and ran. Move it. They sprinted through the corridors, their lights casting twisted shadows around them. The ship was shifting, doors sealing behind them, pathways changing. It was as if the dreadnought was alive, and it did not want them to leave. The airlock was in sight, just a few meters away. And then something grabbed Kai's leg. He screamed, falling as one of the figures crawled out of the floor, its hollow face inches from his. Bonner didn't hesitate. He slammed the butt of his rifle into the creature, yanking Kai free. Get up, damn it. They reached the airlock. Rourke slammed his fist on the panel. Open, open. The doors hissed apart. They jumped inside, slamming the emergency override. The figures stopped just outside the threshold, their heads tilting unnaturally. And then, as the airlock doors sealed shut, They simply vanished. The shuttle detached, engines flaring as it shot back toward the Vanguard. The crew sat in stunned silence, their breaths heavy. Bonner wiped sweat from his forehead. I don't know what the hell that was, but we are never going back. Kai was shaking. They weren't alive. They weren't even real. Rourke's eyes darkened. Then tell me, Lieutenant. He gestured to Kai's leg, where dark, frozen handprints had been burned into his armor. Why did they leave a mark? The shuttle raced back toward the Vanguard, its engines burning hot against the dark void. Inside, the team sat in tense silence, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. The air was thick with unease. Even though they had escaped the alien dreadnought, something about it still clung to them, like an unseen shadow. Kai sat in his seat, staring at the blackened handprints burned into his armor. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling as he traced the marks with his fingers. They weren't real, he whispered. They weren't real, but they touched me. Bonner, still gripping his rifle, ran a hand over his face. I don't care what they were. They weren't friendly. And whatever's on that ship. He shook his head. We should just blow the damn thing to hell. Rourke wasn't so sure. His gut told him this wasn't just some haunted wreck. There was something more, something dangerous. He turned to Kai. Did you pull any data from the ship? Kai nodded slowly, snapping out of his daze. Yeah, I managed to copy some logs, but the files are corrupted. I'll need time to decrypt them. Rourke exhaled. Do it. I want answers before we decide our next move. As the shuttle approached the Vanguard, docking procedures began. The mechanical arms locked the vessel in place, sealing the team back into the safety of their warship. The moment the airlock opened, medical officers rushed in, scanning them for injuries or contamination. You're all clear, one of the medics reported, though she frowned at Kai's armor. Those burns, they don't match any known chemical or energy signatures. Kai didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, lost in thought. The team dispersed. Kai headed straight to the tech lab to work on the data. Bonner stayed behind in the armory, cleaning his weapons with more force than necessary. Rourke went to the bridge. The silence of the void outside felt heavier than usual. Hours passed. Then the alarms screamed. Red emergency lights flashed across the ship, accompanied by a deep, bone-rattling hum. Rourke was on his feet in an instant. Report. A panicked voice crackled over the comms. Sir, we've got a power surge in the AI core. Something is trying to override our systems. Rourke's stomach dropped. Is it coming from outside? Negative, sir, the officer hesitated. The signal. It's coming from inside the ship. A cold chill ran through the room. Rourke turned on the ship-wide comms. All teams, battle stations, lock down critical systems. Then another voice cut in. Kai's, panicked and breathless. Commander, you need to get to the tech lab. Now. Rourke didn't hesitate. He sprinted through the halls, his boots slamming against the metal floors. He reached the tech lab just as Kai turned to face him, his eyes wide with fear. The monitors behind him were glitching, filled with static and impossible symbols that flickered in and out of existence. Kai pointed at the screen. I decrypted the logs. This ship, this whole system, it's a trap. The word sent a shock through Rourke's spine. Explain. Fast. Kai took a shaky breath. That dreadnought wasn't just an alien warship. It was a prison. A containment vessel designed to hold something. Something that could only exist in complete silence. He gestured toward the screen. The logs mention an entity. Not biological, not mechanical, something else. It doesn't move. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't think like we do. And the only way to keep it locked away was to cut it off from all sound. Total silence. Rourke's mind raced. Then why the distress signal? Why now? Kay's hands trembled as he typed. I think it needed us to break the silence. That's why the signal wasn't repeating. It was never meant to be heard. But the moment we played it, He swallowed hard. We woke it up. Before Rourke could respond, the ship shook violently. The lights flickered, and for a brief second, the entire vessel felt wrong, as if the walls themselves had shifted. The comms crackled. Then, a voice. Commander Rourke. A cold dread settled over him. The voice wasn't coming from the comm system. It wasn't coming from any speaker. It was inside his helmet. He looked at Kai, but the tech officer's face had gone pale. "Sir," Kai whispered, "that wasn't me." The ship lurched again, this time more violently. Then the emergency lights died, plunging the Vanguard into complete darkness. And in the silence, something moved. It wasn't a sound, not footsteps, not breathing. But Rourke felt it, a presence sliding through the void, slipping between the spaces where things should not be. Then the whisper came again. "You broke the silence. And now, you will listen." The ship's hull groaned, like metal twisting under an impossible weight. Rourke could hear distant screams. His crew. He grabbed Kai's arm. "We need to get to the bridge. Now." They ran, moving through the corridors as fast as they could. The emergency doors were malfunctioning, opening and closing at random, as if something was controlling them. Then they saw it. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the flickering lights, a figure stood. No, not a figure, a shadow. It had no solid form, no real shape, but it was there, its presence pressing against their senses like a weight. Kai froze in place, his breath hitching. "Oh God." The shadow tilted its head, as if studying them. Then it stepped forward. Rourke fired his weapon. The bullets passed through it like mist, disappearing into nothingness. The shadow did not stop. Rourke grabbed Kai and ran. "Move." They reached the bridge just as Bonner was sealing the security doors. "What the hell is happening?" Rourke didn't have time to explain. "We've been compromised. Something got on board. We need tow." The ship lurched again, and suddenly, the stars outside the viewport vanished. Kai's voice was barely a whisper. "It's sealing us in." Rourke turned to the controls. "Prepare the reactor for a core purge. We need to shut down the entire system." Bonner hesitated. "Sir, that could kill half the crew." Rourke's jaw tightened. "If we don't, none of us are getting out alive." Kai's hands flew over the console. "I'll start the sequence, but we'll only have one chance. If we don't time it right." The screens flickered. The whisper returned. "There is no escape. You are part of the silence now." The bridge plunged into darkness, and the nightmare had only just begun. The Vanguard shuddered violently as the ship's core began to destabilize. Red emergency lights flashed across the walls, casting long, eerie shadows. Rourke's heart raced in his chest as he gripped the control panel. The whisper, that voice that had invaded their minds, still lingered in the silence, like a presence they couldn't escape. The crew had been pushed to their limits. No one had a clear understanding of what was happening, but they knew one thing for certain. They had to stop the nightmare before it consumed them all. "Core purge sequence is almost complete," Kai said, his voice trembling as he typed frantically on his console. His fingers shook with a mix of fear and exhaustion. The pressure was unbearable. "We have less than 5 minutes before it reaches critical levels." Bonner was pacing nearby, his weapon still gripped tightly in his hands, though he hadn't fired a single shot since the shadow appeared. "If we don't do something soon, we're all dead. That thing, whatever it is trying to get into the reactor." Rourke's mind raced. The shadow, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted, it was all connected. That entity was somehow feeding off the fear, drawing strength from the chaos it created. And now it was trying to hijack the reactor, a system that would give it complete control over the ship. If it succeeded, there would be no stopping it. They would all be trapped. "Listen," Rourke said, turning to Bonner and Kai. "We don't have much time. We need to take control of the reactor manually. I'll go down to the lower decks, but I can't do this alone. Bonner, Kai, you're with me." We get to that reactor, we finish the sequence, and we destroy the ship. That's the only way to stop this. Bonner's face was hard, grim. You're talking about blowing up the Vanguard. You know what that means. Rourke met his gaze, his voice steady. I know. But if we don't do it, that thing, whatever it is, will destroy everything we've ever worked for. This is bigger than us. If we don't act now, the silence will spread, and no one will be safe. Kai hesitated, fear evident in his eyes. And what happens if we fail? Rourke didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. They all knew the truth. If they failed, they would be dead. With no time left to waste, the three of them made their way through the corridors of the ship. The air was cold and oppressive, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. Every door, every corner seemed to hide something, lurking just beyond their reach. The presence of the shadow, whatever it was, felt stronger here. It was like a pressure on their chests, a weight that refused to let go. The closer they got to the reactor, the more intense the feeling became. Bonner spoke up first, his voice low and steady. We're close. Stay focused, Rourke replied. Don't let it get to you. Kai, his eyes darting nervously, kept glancing behind them as they moved. It's everywhere. It's in the walls. I can feel it. Rourke didn't say anything. He knew what Kai meant. The ship wasn't just haunted. It was alive, in some twisted way. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was something far worse. The entity was feeding off their fear, using it to gain strength. They were its prey. As they reached the entrance to the reactor room, Rourke paused. He turned to Bonner and Kai. I'm going in first. You two follow. Bonner nodded, his grip on his rifle tightening. Be careful. Rourke stepped forward, tapping his wristband to activate the security clearance. The door slid open with a hiss. Inside, the reactor room was bathed in the faint, eerie glow of emergency lights. The core was humming, pulsating with a dangerous energy. And standing in the middle of the room, the shadow. It was larger now, its form shifting and twisting in a grotesque way. Its edges blurred, like it was trying to break free from the boundaries of reality. It was no longer just a shadow. It was something else, something far more sinister. Rourke's heart slammed in his chest as he raised his weapon. Stay back. The shadow didn't react. It just hovered there, watching them with an empty, soulless gaze. Then the voice came again. This time, it was deeper, more guttural. You cannot escape. You belong to the silence now. The walls of the reactor room began to hum, as if the very structure of the ship was bending under the weight of the entity's power. The air grew thick, stifling, and Rourke could feel it. The pressure, the uncontrollable fear that threatened to break them all. Bonner's voice cut through the tension. We don't have time for this. We need to finish the sequence. Kai nodded, taking a step forward. I'm initiating the override. The purge has to go through. But just as Kai approached the control panel, the shadow lunged. It was faster than any human could react, its tendrils reaching out, warping the air around it. Kai was grabbed by the dark form, his body twisting unnaturally as the shadow's cold, intangible hands wrapped around him. No, Rourke screamed, charging forward. But it was too late. The shadow's grip tightened, and Kai screamed, his voice cutting off as the shadow consumed him whole, his body vanishing into the darkness. No, Bonner roared, raising his rifle, but he was too late. The shadow was already pulling itself back, the space it occupied warping, bending reality around it. Rourke stood frozen, his heart racing. Kai was gone. The shadow had taken him. And then something shifted. The shadow paused, its form flickering for a brief moment. And in that instant, Rourke understood. The entity wasn't just feeding on fear, it was manipulating them, playing on their emotions, using their anger and grief as fuel. Bonner clenched his fist, his voice low and full of pain. We can't let it win. Rourke nodded, his eyes narrowing. We can't. We finish this. He turned to the reactor controls, his hands moving with precision despite the chaos around them. Bonner stood beside him, his rifle still at the ready, his eyes scanning the room. With a deep breath, Rourke activated the core purge sequence. The countdown began, the ship rumbling as the energy built to a critical point. But the shadow didn't retreat. It charged forward, its form warping, ready to strike. Rourke's mind raced. The only way to stop it now was to sacrifice something, a part of themselves. Bonner, as if reading his mind, stepped forward. I'll stay. You need to finish the purge. Rourke's eyes widened. No, you can't. I have to, Bonner said, his voice steady. I'm the only one who can hold it off long enough. Rourke wanted to argue, but he knew there was no time. He knew Bonner was right. He was making the ultimate sacrifice. Bonner's eyes met his. Finish the job. Rourke, don't let it win. With a final nod, Rourke sprinted toward the exit. He could hear Bonner's gunfire as the shadow reached for him, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. The core was about to reach critical mass. The countdown was almost over. And as Rourke reached the airlock, he could feel the ship shuddering, the darkness closing in on him. Bonner's sacrifice had bought him enough time to escape. Rourke slammed his hand on the airlock panel, and the doors slid open, revealing the cold, empty space outside. The Vanguard erupted into a brilliant burst of light as the core detonated, the shockwave rippling through the void. The silence fell over everything, and the nightmare was finally over. But Rourke would never forget the price they had paid. Rourke drifted in the darkness, his breath heavy in his helmet. The explosion had sent him hurtling through space, away from the burning wreckage of the Vanguard. His visor display flickered with warning alerts. Oxygen levels dropping, thruster damage detected, life support failing. He had survived. But for how long? The debris from the Vanguard floated around him, glowing embers of metal and fire scattering like dying stars. He watched in silence as the warship that had been his home for years was reduced to nothing but wreckage. Bonner had been on that ship. His sacrifice had made this possible. But the fight wasn't over. A whisper crawled into his mind. You cannot run from the silence. Rourke's body tensed. The entity was still there. It had survived. He gritted his teeth. The core explosion should have destroyed everything. How was it still alive? His thrusters sputtered as he tried to stabilize himself. He twisted his body, scanning the void for any sign of a way out. Then, in the distance, he saw it, the emergency escape pod. It had been ejected from the Vanguard moments before the explosion, floating aimlessly in the darkness. It was his only chance. He activated his thrusters, but they were weak, damaged from the explosion. He wasn't moving fast enough. The pod was drifting farther away, and his oxygen levels were getting dangerously low. Then he felt it. Something was behind him. The shadow. Rourke didn't dare look. He could feel it pressing against his mind, its presence growing stronger with every second. He forced himself to focus. One goal, one chance. He needed to reach that pod. He manually adjusted the thruster output, diverting the last of the energy into a single desperate push. His body shot forward, closing the distance. The pod was only a few meters away now. But then, darkness moved. The stars around him seemed to twist, bending unnaturally. The entity wasn't just behind him anymore. It was everywhere. Rourke's breath hitched. The whisper came again, curling around his thoughts like a vice. You belong to the void now. His fingers stretched toward the pod's hatch, just a little further. A tendril of darkness lashed out, striking his arm. Pain shot through his body, an unbearable cold sinking into his bones. He gasped, his vision blurring. It was pulling him back. Rourke clenched his jaw. No, not like this. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he reached forward and slammed his other hand onto the escape pod's hatch release. The door hissed open just as the shadow's tendrils coiled around his legs. Rourke kicked off, using the last of his thruster power to propel himself inside. The moment his body cleared the entrance, he hit the emergency seal button. The hatch slammed shut. For a moment, silence. Then, a deafening thud. The shadow slammed against the pod, its form pressing against the reinforced glass of the viewport. It was trying to get in. Its shape twisted and warped, pressing itself against the barrier, whispering inside his mind. There is nowhere left to run. Rourke's hands flew over the controls. The pod's systems flickered to life. Fuel was low, thrusters barely operational, but it was enough. He punched the ignition. The escape pod blasted forward, tearing through the void, leaving the wreckage and the shadow behind. For the first time since this nightmare began, Rourke let out a breath of relief. He had made it. He was alive. The pod's navigation system scanned the surrounding area, searching for the nearest friendly ship. A distress beacon activated, sending out a call for rescue. But as he stared out into space, his relief faded. The shadow was still there. It hadn't disappeared. It was drifting, following him. It wasn't bound to the Vanguard. It wasn't tied to the wreckage. It was tied to him. Rourke's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't over. The chase wasn't finished, and the silence was still coming for him. Rourke sat in the cramped escape pod, his breathing heavy, his mind racing. The navigation system beeped weakly, struggling to maintain a stable course. Fuel reserves were critical. Oxygen levels were low. But those were the least of his worries. Out in the void, it was still there. The shadow drifted in space, keeping pace with the pod. It didn't need thrusters or fuel. It just moved, gliding through the dark like it belonged there. Like it was waiting. Rourke's fingers clenched into fists. The explosion of the Vanguard should have been the end. Bonner's sacrifice should have meant something. But this thing, the entity, the silence, had survived. And it was still coming for him. He forced himself to stay calm. The pod's distress beacon was active. If there were any nearby human ships, they'd pick up the signal. He wasn't alone in this fight. He couldn't be. A flicker on the radar. Rourke's eyes snapped to the screen. A ship, large, heavily armed, human, was approaching fast. His heart pounded. Reinforcements. He wasn't going to die out here. The comms crackled to life. Unidentified escape pod. This is the Valiant. We've received your distress signal. State your name and condition. Rourke exhaled sharply, his voice hoarse. Commander Rourke, from the Vanguard. My ship is gone. Requesting immediate pickup. A brief silence. Then, copy that, Commander. Stand by for retrieval. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. His gaze flicked back to the viewport. The shadow was still there, and it was moving faster now. The Valiant loomed ahead, a massive warship with gun batteries lining its hull. It was built for battle. A fortress in space, humanity's best defense. But the silence didn't care. The entity suddenly lunged forward, closing the distance between them. Rourke's pulse spiked. It wasn't after the wreckage. It wasn't after his ship. It was after humanity. Rourke slammed the comms button. Valiant, do you see that thing? The shadow outside my pod. A pause. Then the voice came back, confused. Negative. Commander, we only see your pod. Rourke's blood ran cold. They couldn't see it, but he could feel it. And then, the whispers came back. This is only the beginning. The escape pod jolted as it was pulled into the Valiant's hangar. The moment the hatch opened, Rourke ripped off his helmet and stumbled onto the deck. Human voices, human faces. The sight of his own people should have reassured him. It didn't. A group of Marines rushed toward him. Their uniforms bore the insignia of the Terran Defense Fleet. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, stepped forward. Commander Rourke, I'm Captain Hayes. You're safe now. Safe? No, he wasn't. None of them were. Rourke grabbed her arm, his grip tight. You don't understand. It's still out there. She frowned. What is? The entity. The thing that killed my crew. His voice was raw. It survived. It's following us. Hayes exchanged a glance with her officers. Commander, we scanned the area. There's nothing out there. Rourke shook his head violently. You're wrong. It's there. It's watching. A cold silence filled the hangar. The crew shifted uncomfortably. They thought he was losing it. But then, the ship's lights flickered. The air grew heavy. And in that moment, Rourke knew. It was already inside. A scream rang out from the far end of the hangar. A Marine dropped to his knees, clutching his helmet, as if something was crawling inside his head. The others turned, their weapons raised, but there was nothing to shoot at. Rourke's stomach twisted. It had already begun. The shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally. The ship's metal groaned as if under some invisible weight. The entity wasn't attacking with weapons. It was attacking their minds. Hayes took a step back, gripping her sidearm. What the hell is this? Rourke's jaw tightened. The war had already started. We need to fight, he said, his voice steady. Right now. Hayes hesitated for only a moment. Then she nodded, turning to her officers. Lock down the ship. Get the AI firewalls up. Now. The Marines scrambled into action. The alarms blared. The battle wasn't just for survival anymore. It was for humanity itself. Rourke took a deep breath, staring into the growing darkness. The silence had come for them. But this time, humanity wouldn't run. They would fight.